Chapter 1. Cassie Morgan stared at the man in front of her, trembling with anger. So you've decided that the girls aren't allowed to stay here? How could you do that? This is their home. The man had no right to enter what had been her office for the past 15 years and tell her she had to leave. I've already explained, Mrs. Morgan. The church doesn't believe that girls and boys should be housed under the same roof if they're not related by blood. We're willing to allow the girls under 12 to stay here until we're able to find them good families, but the older girls must go. Why, when I arrived I saw one of the older girls flirting with one of the boys right here in this house. I was aghast. John Dare shook his head disgustedly. That will not be happening under my watch. Cassie sat back in her seat facing the desk she usually sat behind. The town could no longer afford to run the orphanage, so they'd asked a church known for its good deeds to take over the finances. The church had sent in their own man to work with Cassie during the time of transition. In other words, they'd sent him there to help her get rid of the older girls and go far away with them. But where will we go? I've hired a man to take you and the girls to nowhere in a bus. I'm surprised he's not here yet. He glanced toward the window as if expecting the man to show up at any moment. Nowhere? He's going to take us to the middle of nowhere and leave us? How do you expect us to survive? Cassie knew she wasn't being forced to go with the children, but she'd been running the orphanage since her husband had died when she was only 21. They were as much her family as if she'd given birth to them. Mr. Dare sighed, shaking his head. You don't understand, Mrs. Morgan. I'm sending you all to nowhere, Texas. The church has purchased a house there, and you'll be raising the girls in that house. Cassie's eyes widened. Texas? Wasn't Texas still overrun with heathens? Could she keep the girls safe? Yes, Texas. Nowhere is a small town. It's the perfect place to raise girls. There are fewer women than men in Texas, so the girls can easily be married off. They have been taught to cook and keep house, haven't they? Mr. Dare eyed her as if he expected her to have neglected even the simplest things the girls should be able to do. Why did he assume the worst of her? Well, of course, they have, but Texas? She had no desire to travel all the way to Texas. Why can't we go by train? She had never been on a bus or a train, but she'd heard trains were much more comfortable. There is a train station in town, but it'll be much more cost-effective if you and the girls take a bus. You can camp on the side of the road along the way. It will be an adventure. He said adventure with such a bored voice she knew even he didn't believe the words. Cassie shook her head immediately. But food? How will I feed the girls? Will the church be sending money to help finance the orphanage there? She couldn't just move to a new town and start asking for money and food for her girls. The townspeople had done much of the funding of the orphanage over the years. You'll be sent a small monthly stipend, of course. Mr. Hayes has been told to purchase enough supplies for the trip. You'll leave first thing in the morning. Tomorrow? But I can't possibly have 15 girls ready to travel by tomorrow morning. How was she even going to be able to tell them? They would all be devastated. Mr. Dare shrugged. I really don't see that you have a choice in the matter. He looked up at a knock on the door jamb. The door had been left open for their conversation for propriety's sake. May I help you? Cassie turned to see a man in his early 30s stride into the room. He was handsome in a rugged way, and she followed him with her eyes. He was tall with dark hair and beautiful eyes. They were mesmerizing. Most people with hair as black as his had brown eyes, but his were a slate gray. I'm Valentino Hayes. I'm here to take some people to Texas. His voice was so deep it was almost gravelly. Cassie felt her stomach flutter at his words. Mrs. Morgan will be traveling with you. Mr. Dare nodded at Cassie. When the man turned to her, Cassie stared up at him in wonder. He had to be the tallest man she'd ever seen. Of course, she was a tall woman herself, so she wasn't intimidated a bit. She did wish he'd sit down, though. Maybe she was a little intimidated. Why were you going to Texas, Mrs. Morgan? He leaned back onto her desk and crossed his arms over his chest as if he had all day to talk to her about the trip. Cassie wondered what this man had been told about his task. 10 years ago, she'd have been too shy to talk to him, but years of experience with teenage boys had changed her. Because I'm being forced to. I've been the matron of this orphanage for 15 years now, and I've just been informed that I can keep my position, but only if I take all the girls aged 12 and older and relocate with them to Texas. Tino's eyes narrowed. All women? Why, he'd go insane in about an hour. No one had said a word to him about taking a bunch of ladies. He thought he was transporting men, or at least a mix of women and men. Of course, there was something compelling about the woman in front of him. Maybe he could help her somehow. He turned back to Mr. Dare. I think you hired the wrong man. I don't transport women. Especially women who are being sent away against their will. His voice was hard, and with his size, he knew he could overwhelm the man. Maybe intimidation would work in his favor. Mr. Dare rose to his feet. Oh? What about the money we gave you for the job? Tino frowned. I've already purchased the supplies. I'll give you the money you paid me, plus the supplies. He hooked his thumbs in his belt, waiting for the other man to answer him. He needed the money to follow the new leads, but that didn't matter. He could always make more. Mr. Dare shrugged. I suppose that's all right. He looked at Cassie, who was still seated in the chair across from her old desk. Mrs. Morgan? Inform the girls that as of tomorrow morning all of you will be homeless. You may have the supplies Mr. Hayes purchased to live on. Tino looked at Mrs. Morgan, who was sitting in her chair, nibbling her lip nervously. She seemed like a good woman. Is there anywhere you can go? He asked. He couldn't let them stay in the cold. Why, if he had a home of his own, he'd invite her to go with him, but he'd been traveling his entire adult life. Searching. She shook her head. There's nowhere for us. She'd sold off the house she shared with her husband years before, and it had been a tiny one-bedroom house anyway. There was no way she could fit 15 girls in it. Her parents were dead. She had no one but the children, and nothing that wasn't in the house there. No, she had no choice but to go to Texas. Tino sighed disgustedly. Fine. I'll take them. He couldn't believe he was going to be making a 2-week drive with a bunch of women. Lord help him. If he'd wanted a woman around all the time, he'd have married one. If he ever stayed in one place for more than a month, he might just do that anyway. We leave at dawn. Be ready. Cassie wanted to cry with relief. She didn't want to go to Texas, but her girls needed a home. We'll be waiting. She watched as he walked out the door, before jumping to her feet. I guess I'd better go tell the girls that they're about to move to Texas, and they need to pack their things. She had nothing more to say to the man. She hoped she never set eyes on him again. He may be doing what he'd been told by the church, but he could have handled it in a kinder way. Somehow, she was certain he had a big role to play in the decision to send them away being made in the first place. Without another word, she strode from the room and up the long staircase to the girls' rooms. There were 2 sections upstairs, one for the older girls and one for the boys. She called all the girls into one of the 2 rooms they shared. With much giggling and silliness, the girls settled on the beds and looked at her. Cassie had a heavy heart. The girls were sweet as candy, and she loved every one of them. Ruby worried her the most. She and David, one of the other orphans, had been courting, and she knew Ruby would be sad to have to leave. I have some bad news for you, and I need you to help me with a bad situation. All giggling stopped and the girls grew serious. Are we being kicked out? Opal, Ruby's twin, asked in a whisper. Opal had always been intuitive, understanding things the others didn't. Doesn't the church want us here? Cassie thought about the best way to break the news to them, and after a moment, decided the blunt truth was the best. She'd always tried to tell all of the children the truth about everything. No, they really don't. They've decided they want this to be a boys' home. All of the younger girls will be found homes with good families, but you and me? We're going to be leaving tomorrow on a bus bound for nowhere, Texas. There's a house the church has purchased there, and that's where we'll live. Ruby jumped to her feet, her eyes filled with tears. I'm not going. I've lived here my whole life. She threw her hands up in the air. What about David? Cassie stepped forward and enveloped the girl in her arms. I know, sweetheart. It's here or get kicked out with nowhere to go. She hated the idea of tearing the girls from their home, but the alternative was so much worse. Opal stood and walked to her sister, wrapping her arm around her as soon as Cassie released her. We'll be together. We can make it work. Katie, a tiny blonde who was the youngest girl in the room, spoke up then. Texas is so far. How long will it take us to get there? Cassie frowned. I believe our driver said 2 weeks. We'll be taking a bus. She sighed. I'm sorry, girls. I tried to talk Mr. Dare out of making us go, but his mind was set. She looked over the sad faces of all the girls in the room. 15 girls, plus herself, would be leaving their home against their will the following day. All in the name of doing God's will. I really am sorry. I wish I could make things different. Evelyn, the only girl other than the twins who was 17, got to her feet and faced the others. We have a lot of work to do, friends. It's time we got started. We all know how to work hard, and we're going to be ready come morning. Cassie watched as Evelyn assigned all the girls specific tasks to prepare for the trip. She was a natural-born leader, and she made Cassie's heart fill with pride watching her. Evelyn was special to her. She had come as a quiet, shy 3-year-old and was the first child to arrive after Cassie had taken over. It hadn't been easy to get the young girl out of her shell, but once she had, she'd blossomed into a beautiful young lady. Yes, the girls were in good hands, with Evelyn directing them. She quietly left the room, heading down the stairs to pack up her own things. On her way down, she glanced at the clock over the mantel. It was already 6 in the evening. They only had 12 hours to get everything done. She hoped they could make it. Chapter 2. It wasn't quite light out when she and the girls stood in front of the orphanage the following morning, waiting for Mr. Hayes to arrive with his bus. They'd read about buses, but really? None of them had ever even seen one. She kept telling herself it would be a great adventure. The older boys had woken to help them carry their things down the stairs, and they all stood waiting with them. Several of the girls were leaving their brothers and younger sisters behind them, but there was no choice. Tearful goodbyes were said. Ruby clung to David as if she'd refused to leave at the last minute, but they both knew they couldn't make it on their own just yet. When the bus pulled up in front of the orphanage, the boys carried the trunks to it and loaded it while Mr. Hayes got out and shook his head, mumbling something under his breath about traveling with a bunch of women. Cassie ignored him as she said goodbye to the boys, hugging each of them in turn. I'm going to miss all of you, she said after she'd hugged Ethan, the oldest of the boys. Goodbye. I hope we'll all be reunited again someday. She brushed a tear from her eye as she climbed aboard the bus and took a seat at the front. Everyone set? Tino asked, realizing it was an emotional time and not wanting to be too intrusive. When there was no response, he shifted into gear and pulled the bus onto the dirt road that led to the orphanage. Cassie had never been in a motor vehicle before, and the shaking of the bus frightened her a bit. She knew none of her girls had ever traveled this way either, though, so she kept her feelings hidden. They'd been traveling for almost an hour before she said anything to the driver. Most of the girls had fallen back to sleep as soon as the vehicle started moving. It was no wonder, because they'd been up half the night not wanting to miss even a moment of their last night at home. How often will we stop for nature breaks, Mr. Hayes? She needed to know the man would take her girls' needs into consideration during the long journey. Just call me Tino. I'm not big on formalities. And he wanted to hear his name on her lips. Why he wasn't certain, but he had to hear it. Cassie bit her lip for a moment. Was it proper? They'd be together for 2 weeks on a bus with 15 girls. That wasn't proper, so what did it matter if they were on a first-name basis? I'm Cassie. She knew the church would never approve of them using first names for each other, but she didn't care. The church wasn't happy with her anyway, although she didn't know why. Well, Cassie, I'll stop whenever you ladies need to stop, but I brought provisions for 14 days. If we're on the road for longer than that, we're going to have to stop and buy food, and I'm guessing you don't have a whole lot of money with you. He had the money the church had given him, and he could use a small portion of it, but most of it needed to help him with his search. Cassie didn't have much money anywhere. Every extra dime she'd made had been poured back into the orphanage. There had always been repairs needed, and the children had needed new clothes. What right did she have to keep the money that could be helping them? Will we be stopping for lunch? We're going to have to. I need to eat too, and there's no way I can steer this thing and eat at the same time. I figure we'll drive as soon as it's daylight every day and stop when it's dark. We'll take an hour for lunch. He paused. He hadn't thought about cooking. She didn't expect him to do that, did she? You'll do the cooking, won't you? Yes, of course. The girls and I will cook. She enjoyed cooking, and although she'd never done it over a campfire, she was certain it wouldn't be a problem. What would you have done if I'd said no? He shrugged. Eaten a whole lot of nothing for 2 weeks, probably. Not that there will be any fancy meals from the provisions I purchased. I found a list of things that people used to buy for the Oregon Trail and stocked up on those things. Cassie smiled. I've seen those lists. I hope you didn't buy that much. She envisioned piles and piles of food and other supplies. Things they certainly wouldn't be able to go through during a 2-week trip. Not quite, but I knew I'd be traveling for at least 2 weeks with around 20 people. I bought a lot. He was glad now that he had. Now that I know your situation, I think you should keep anything that's left to help feed you and the girls. I'm not sure how much support you'll be getting from a church that kicked all of you out. I'm worried about that. We'll make do, though. I really think they chose to send us out west thinking we'd get the girls married off faster, and they wouldn't be a burden on the church for as long. She kept her voice low, hoping none of the girls would hear her. They all appeared to be sleeping, so she continued. Mr. Dare alluded to that fact while I was in my office with him. Your office? I thought that was his office? The more Tino heard about the situation, the angrier he became. Cassie made a face. It was my office until about 45 minutes before you arrived. He walked in and let me know what was expected of me. I was given no choice in anything. How long have you worked there? Tino couldn't imagine being expected to change his entire world the way she was. Sure, he had never really put down roots anywhere, but she obviously had, and she should be able to keep those roots firmly in the dirt if that's what she wanted to do. Since my husband died 15 years ago, she said softly. She still missed Stanley, even after all the years. She'd been away from him longer than she'd ever had him in her life. You must have married young. He wouldn't have guessed her to be much over 30. He hoped he was wrong, because marrying that young just wasn't right. I was 20. He died less than a year after we married. I'm sorry to hear that. Thank you. She said the words automatically. She'd heard the same sentiment so many times over the years. Have you ever been married, Tino? No, ma'am, never even come close. Cassie wasn't certain what to say to that. She felt bad for him. People with no real connections with others were sad people indeed. Where do you live? Here and there. I mainly go where the work takes me. He didn't add that he traveled around so much searching for his brother. It was a long story to explain, and he preferred people come to their own conclusions. If they treated him like he was less of a man for traveling in a seemingly aimless way, well, that was their call. Do you always drive people in a bus? She asked. Oh no, I was doing some repairs on the church, and they asked me if I knew how to drive. Next thing I knew, I'd agreed to drive from upstate New York to Texas. We appreciate the ride. It's much better than having nowhere to go. Cassie covered her mouth to hide her yawn. She'd slept less than the girls had. It was well after 2 when she'd finally fallen asleep, and she was up before 5. Why don't you rest your eyes for a bit? You don't have to talk to me. I'm being paid to do a job. That doesn't mean you have to do it in solitude. Cassie yawned again. But I will nap, just this once. I was up half the night packing my things. Once I was finally in bed, I tossed and turned. I've never lived anywhere but Orlan. My condolences, ma'am. He grinned, glad she couldn't see his smile from behind him. Cassie gave a half laugh as she turned to get more comfortable. She wasn't fond of buses, but they were traveling faster than they would have been with a covered wagon or on foot. She supposed she should be grateful for the convenience. It was close to noon when Tino let his hunger get the best of him. He was surprised at how quiet the ladies all were through the morning. Every single one of them slept, and he stared at the road. He felt oddly responsible for the whole lot of them. He couldn't wait until they were in Texas and settled so he could return the bus and move on with his life. He wasn't made to act like a father. He parked under the shade of a tree, still in New York. It was spring and the flowers were in bloom. He was certain the girls would like that. Where are we? Cassie rubbed her eyes, wishing she could have slept for several more hours. She looked behind her and saw the girls starting to stir without the motion of the bus, still in New York. It's almost noon, and I'm getting hungry. This looked like a nice spot to stop. Cassie looked out the window and smiled. The girls are going to want to stay all day. I'll go start a fire. He kept his head down, not wanting her to see that he was pleased at the idea of making the girls happy. What was wrong with him? He found some sticks and got the matches from the back of the bus. There was a circle of rocks where some other weary traveler had obviously had the same idea. Probably several of them. There were big boulders close by that could be used as chairs. Cassie stepped off the bus, her arms full of quilts. These will be nice to sit on. Now, where's the food? He gestured to the back of the bus, and she walked there, digging through what he'd brought. She frowned. There wasn't a lot there for a quick meal. She found what she needed for some pancakes, though. There was bacon as well. It wouldn't be the best meal in the world, but it would fill their bellies. After they stopped for the evening, she'd be certain to cook enough for lunch the next day. That way they could just heat it up in the hour they had. The girls slowly found their way off the bus, going into the trees to take care of their personal needs. Cassie expertly mixed the pancakes and put the cast-iron frying pan over the fire, carefully setting the bacon in. Betsy, one of her 16-year-old charges, was the first to return. Betsy, you mind the bacon, while I finish mixing up the pancakes? Yes, ma'am. Betsy was soft-spoken and eager to please. She rarely spoke unless someone spoke to her first. As the other girls trickled back from the woods, she assigned them each a task. Some spread blankets, and some readied a basin with water from the lake. Tino, watching them work together with the ease of years of practice, was fascinated. Each girl almost seemed to know what she'd be assigned to do before Cassie said a word. Less than 20 minutes after he stopped the bus, they were all seated with plates in their hands. He took a bite of bacon, and saw everyone staring at him. What? One of the girls with blonde hair and blue eyes made a face. We say grace before we eat. Cassie shook her head. Sarah Jane, it's not your place to correct your elders. She didn't care if their whole lives were in upheaval, her girls were going to act with the manners they'd been taught. Yes'm. Sarah Jane lowered her face, but Tino could tell she wasn't truly contrite. Hope, would you mind saying our prayer? Cassie asked, looking at a young girl with dark hair and brown eyes. Hope nodded. Heavenly Father. We thank you for the food you provided. Thank you for a bus to take us to Texas and for not making us walk, even though you let us get kicked out of our home by some of your people. We pray that you will forgive people who do bad things in your name. In Jesus' name. Amen. Tino bit his lip to keep from laughing. He was relatively certain that wasn't the kind of prayer Cassie had been looking for. Amen, he said loudly. He liked hope. He hated when girls felt like they weren't allowed to be honest about how they felt. Even if she never complained about her situation, she had made her feelings known in that prayer, and he could only applaud her for it. Cassie was smiling at the girl, an expression of love on her face. Thank you, Hope. Hope just smiled and focused on her food. Tino looked between the two of them, wondering if Cassie had known that's what Hope would say in her prayer. He thought she probably had known, and his respect for her went up another notch. He'd never met a woman he could truly respect, but he knew sitting across that fire, there was a woman worthy of it. Chapter 3. While they rode that afternoon, Cassie decided not to waste their time in the car, and assigned each girl a specific Bible passage to memorize about whatever she felt the girl should work on. I'll listen to your recitations around the campfire this evening. It will be a nice way to pass the time. Tino realized as he listened to Cassie why she was so good at her job. She truly cared about the girls, but not only that, she was determined to make them better people. They had spent some time sleeping that morning, but she wouldn't allow them to even waste their time on the long journey. No, they'd all be productive. He found he admired the woman more with every minute he spent with her. At sunset, as promised, Tino found a quiet spot along the side of the road for them to set up camp. He worked to set up tents while the girls got supper ready. All of them worked together, laughing and joking. He noticed that the smallest of them sat on a rock beside the fire and sang to the others. Her voice was pure and true. He didn't know if she was trying to get out of work, or if that's how they preferred things, but he liked it. Cassie called him to eat much later. I'm sorry it took us so long to cook tonight. We'll get the hang of getting supper over a fire. He looked at the plate she handed him with a smile. It took you so long to cook, because you made a real meal. This looks downright appetizing. He wandered over and took his spot across the fire from Cassie, watching her through the flames. She'd made fried potatoes with bacon mixed in. He wasn't certain what kind of seasoning they'd put in, but it smelled good. Hattie, would you say grace for us this evening? Cassie asked one of the younger girls. She was a redhead and seemed to have a sparkle permanently in her eyes. Tino had noticed her that morning. She seemed almost excited to be going on an adventure. Yes, ma'am. Hattie bowed her head. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this meal you've provided and for this journey. Thank you for providing us with a bus and a skilled driver like Mr. Hayes. We will be eternally thankful that you didn't allow us to be ejected from our home with nowhere to go. We pray all of this in the name of your Son. Amen. Tino closed his eyes to savor the taste of the food as he took the first bite. Cassie, this is pure bliss on my tongue. How did you make this? Cassie laughed softly. I came up with the idea of what to fix, but I could never have seasoned it so perfectly. Sarah Jane is a miracle woman with food. Tino looked at the girl who had gotten on to him for eating without waiting for a prayer earlier. Thank you, Sarah Jane. This is delicious, Sarah Jane nodded. God has given me the gift of food. I take all his gifts seriously. Tino sighed. She seemed like a sweet girl, but her religious fervor was a bit much for him. It was already much later than he'd expected to be eating. They'd have to get to their bedrolls almost immediately after the dishes were finished. He looked at the youngest girl who had been singing instead of working. You have a beautiful voice. The little blonde smiled and nodded. I have a gift as well. Tino looked at Cassie. Has she had formal training? Cassie laughed. An orphan doesn't receive formal training in singing. She just does what comes naturally to her. She smiled at the girl who had come to her as an infant. Katie has always had the ability to sing that way. We had a beautiful piano at the house in Orlan, and she could play it with no training at all. Katie pouted. I'm sad we had to leave the piano behind. Tino shrugged. There's no way we could have fit it on the bus. He felt badly for the child that she'd had to leave such a prized possession, but he knew better than anyone that you couldn't always keep the things, or the people, important to you around. Cassie smiled consolingly. Katie understands that. Music is just very important to her. She used to have solos all the time at church. We find we'd rather have her sing to us while we work. She does fine work, so that's not it. We just love her sweet voice. It makes us work happily. When supper was over, the girls jumped up and got to work once again. One group collected some food and started to mix things together. Another group collected the dishes and heated some water from a nearby stream. Cassie seemed to be directing one group while one of the older girls directed the other. Tino sat and watched it all in awe, amazed that they worked so well together. Had they discussed how things would go while they cooked, or did they all just know their place? Cassie walked over to where Tino sat on the ground on one of the blankets she'd put out. I felt like we didn't have a very good lunch today, because there was no time to prepare it, so I have some of the girls preparing tomorrow's lunch. Just a big pot of beans, but it'll cook over the fire all night. I hope that's all right with you. Tino nodded. Sounds very smart. You have very well-trained young ladies there. Cassie smiled. We've worked together for many years. As older girls leave, the younger ones have taken over the harder chores. They all know how to work hard and just how I want things. Can you sit with me? Take a quick break? He found himself wanting to spend more and more time with her, something that had never happened to him before. Cassie shook her head. No, I need to work with the girls. I don't want to set a bad example for them by sitting while they work. She shrugged. Besides, I sat all day. It feels good to be up and moving around for a bit. Tino sighed. Will you walk with me after they're sleeping? Cassie looked at him in surprise. I don't know if that's a good idea, Tino. The girls have to be my first priority. What if someone comes along and it's just the girls here alone? He made a face. How about if you meet me here by the fire once they're sleeping? It's a long trip with no real adult conversation. Cassie considered it and finally nodded. He must need to discuss something about the trip with her without the girls listening. I will do that. As soon as the girls are down for the night, I'll come out here with you. You know I set up a tent for you alone, don't you? Cassie was startled. Why, I thought I'd be sleeping with the girls. He shook his head. There are 2 huge tents for the girls, and 2 small ones for you and me. What are we going to do if it rains? He laughed. We'll sleep on the bus. Won't be comfortable by any means, but we can make it happen. She nodded, wandering back to where the girls were cooking, with Evelyn leading them all. It was always easy for her to divide everyone into 2 work groups, because Evelyn was a natural-born leader. There was no doubt in Cassie's mind that if Evelyn had been the one leading the French army, they wouldn't have lost at Waterloo. Stop telling me what to do, Gertie. Sarah Jane complained. Evelyn's in charge of our group. Mrs. Morgan said so. Gertrude folded her arms over her chest. But you could be so much more efficient if you'd just listen to me. Cassie stepped up behind the girls. It was a fight she'd heard many times. Gertie wanted to be in charge, because she always saw a better way to do things. And her ways were often better. Gertie was exceptionally bright, but her ideas came across as bossy to the other girls, and they became easily frustrated with her. Gertie, I need you to chop up the bacon for the beans for lunch tomorrow. No complaining now. Cassie knew from experience that the only way to stop the bickering was to step in herself and tell the girls what she needed them to do. Evelyn would be able to run things fine as soon as Gertie knew her place. Gertie sighed. Yes, ma'am. Cassie moved back to the other group who already had the dishes finished and were stowing them back into the box Tino had brought them out in. Let's leave them by the fire, Cassie suggested. We'll need at least some of them in the morning for breakfast. Yes, Mrs. Morgan, Alice said, moving to do as she was told immediately. Cassie smiled at the girl. Alice had come to live in the orphanage when she was 10 and already set in her ways. There was very little humor in the girl, and for that, Cassie was always sorry. She did her best with her, though, trying to teach her that everything in life wasn't always serious. Each of the girls was so different, and she loved them all equally. Ruby and Opal were the oldest of the 15 girls that she had with her. They were twins who'd been in the orphanage since they were 5. At 17, they didn't remember any other life. Evelyn was only a few months younger than the twins. She had been in the orphanage since her mother had died in childbirth, and her father had been incapable of taking care of her. Gertrude, Betsy, and Hope were all 16. Gertie was the smartest girl in the entire orphanage. All of her teachers remarked on how brilliant she was, but she had a hard time making her opinions known to others without coming across as bossy. Betsy was quiet and shy, soft-spoken, and eager to please. If anything was asked of her, she jumped to do it immediately. Hope was honest to a fault. Anything she thought typically came out of her mouth later. It was both her best feature and her biggest fault. Penelope and Sarah Jane were both 15. Penelope was an excellent seamstress and was generally good at any type of craft with her hands. She was able to take the dresses that were donated to the orphanage for the girls' use and turn them into something amazing. Without Penny, the girls would have been embarrassed to wear what they had to school. Sarah Jane had been temporarily adopted by a pastor and his wife, but they had found that they were unable to keep her. When she returned to the orphanage, she had developed a kind of religious fervor that was annoying to most of the other children. Her cooking skills were unparalleled. Cassie wished she could cook half as well as Sarah Jane. Minnie and Alice were her 14-year-olds. Minnie was often put in charge of watching the younger children. She was a natural nurturer, she gravitated to the babies and toddlers. Alice seemed incapable of joking and laughing. She was always so concerned with propriety and serious that Cassie often worried about her. She hoped the girl found her sense of humor later in life. Martha and Dorothy were 13. Martha had come to her left on the doorstep with a broken arm at 5 years old. Cassie knew little about the girl's past, only knew that she'd been abused somehow. Cassie had never met anyone who was as loving as and wonderful as Martha. Dorothy found the good in everyone. She loved and was loved by everyone who touched her life. Teresa, Hattie, and Katie were all 12. Teresa often wore Cassie out with her constant talking. Hattie's personality was pure sunshine. Anytime any of the other children were upset or sad for any reason, Hattie could make them smile. Katie, who had just turned 12, was the youngest of the group and she had the voice of a nightingale. Cassie had never heard anyone sing the way young Katie could, so she did everything she could to nurture the girls' talents. As Cassie got them ready for bed, she thought about each of their differences. She hoped that their new life in Texas would allow them to each develop even more into their own person. Leaving everything they knew behind was going to be extremely difficult, and she hoped they were up for the challenge. Chapter 4. Once the girls were all settled on the ground for the night, Cassie went out to the fire to talk to Tino as she had promised. She hoped the man wasn't going to tell her that he needed to turn back for some reason, because she wasn't sure what she would do. There was nowhere to go in New York any longer. While she hated to admit it, it could no longer be her home. He was waiting for her, still sitting in front of the fire, watching the huge black pot of beans boil. He poked at the fire with a stick, looking up at her. "How do you feel today?" went. Cassie stood beside him, feeling uncomfortable with what she should do. Should she sit beside him where they could communicate more easily, or would that be forward? Finally she sat down, but kept several feet between them. "I think the girls did well with the travel." She fussed with the skirt of her dress. "How do you feel like it went?" Tino looked over at Cassie, wondering why she was so far away from him. "I think they did well." "What did you think of traveling on a bus?" "I assume it's the first time you've done it." "It was interesting. I'm amazed at how fast we were able to travel. Why, we must have been going 15 miles per hour. Cassie had only dreamed of such high speeds. He laughed. "It was right about 10. Automobiles can go much faster, but the buses only go 10 miles per hour at their top speed. I'm just amazed that anything can go that fast. I do think it's a good idea that you have lunch ready for tomorrow. It'll be nice not to have to spend so much time on our break. I hate wasting daylight." He had a lead on his brother in Texas, and he wanted to get there quickly. Cassie smiled. "You must always work outdoors." "It's never bothered me to waste daylight, because there's always work to be done inside." Tino shrugged. "I've worked both inside and outside. I do whatever needs to be done whenever it needs to be done." "So you don't really have a steady job?" He didn't seem like a man who would be content to travel around where the jobs took him. He seemed so much more level-headed than that to her. I spent the last 12 years searching for my younger brother. I do whatever work I can find and travel where the search takes me. There's always a job to be found, no matter where I go. He shrugged. As much as he'd like to put down roots and settle down, he just couldn't do it yet. Cassie frowned. How did you lose your brother? I didn't exactly lose him. My mother left me on someone's doorstep when I was 6. I have vague memories of a younger brother named Sebastian. I've been trying to find him ever since I was old enough to leave home. Oh, that's sad. Do you know why your mother abandoned you? He shook his head. I remember her being ill, but I'm not sure what was wrong. I was young. Have you thought of looking for your mother? She couldn't understand why he searched for his brother, but not the woman who had given birth to him. Maybe the brother was still with her. I found her grave not long after I started searching. She died when I was 7. I'm sorry to hear that. Cassie wasn't surprised by his story, because she'd seen so many orphans come through the home. Their stories were always interesting, and sad. He shrugged. It was a long time ago. But you still want to find your brother? Tino nodded. He's the only family I have. Who raised you? I was left on the doorstep of the wealthiest people in town. They raised me. They treated me like family for the most part. For the most part? Yes, for the most part. They were an older couple, and their children were already raised. I was treated as a family member as long as none of their real grandchildren were around. It was better than most orphan children had, he realized. He wasn't given the nicest clothes, but he got good clothes. He was even treated with love and respect. Cassie sighed. At least you were usually treated as a member of the family. So many people would have dumped you off somewhere else. I'm glad you had a family. Tino shrugged. Oh, I am too. The woman who raised me died 5 years ago. I felt bad that I wasn't with her when it happened. And the man? He died while I was still in school. I've been alone since I finished school. Never had he wanted that to change. Finding his brother had become a mission, and he didn't know what he would do once he found him. He had some good leads on where he was, and part of the trip to Texas would be investigating some of those leads. I'll pray that you find him. Cassie had had no siblings, but she couldn't imagine what it would be like to suddenly lose one. What about you? Do you have family? Tino found he wanted to know everything about her. Cassie shook her head. Only the children. My father died while I was a child, and my mother died a few years back. I lost my husband to a hunting accident not long after we were married. I've been alone ever since. She smiled. At least I've had the children to keep me grounded. I don't know what I would have done without them. I guess they're more than a job to you, they're everything to me. Without them, I don't know that my life would have any kind of purpose. It's certainly not how I imagined I would be living when I was growing up, but I'm content. Content was such a mild word for what she felt for the children. She didn't think she could love any of them more had she given birth to them herself. Tino frowned. Why he felt jealous of the children, he didn't know. He'd only known her for 24 hours, but already he wanted her to be a big part of his life. He couldn't ask a woman to live as he did. Are you worried about what life will be like once you get to Texas? Do you have any idea what the house they purchased for you is like? None whatsoever. And yes, I am worried. How can I not be? My whole world is turned upside down with this. She shrugged. At least I'll still have the girls. He looked at her by the light of the campfire, and she looked beautiful in the dim light. He wanted to reach out to her, to stroke her arm, but he didn't know how she'd react. They'd known one another for such a short time, but already his feelings were growing for her. Do you ever get lonely? How can I get lonely? I'm constantly surrounded by children. She laughed. Sometimes I wish I had time to be lonely. Don't. Being lonely isn't something I'd wish on my worst enemy. He stared into the fire for a moment. I'm surprised you never remarried. You're still young. And beautiful, he thought. Why hadn't she remarried? She sighed. At first, I wasn't ready. That's why I started working with the children. Now, it's more that I don't know anyone. When you spend all your time with children, there's no time for any adults. He eyed her. Do you think you'd be open to marriage again if you met the right man? She shrugged. Probably. But he'd have to be all right with me spending time with the children. I can't imagine life without them now. He sighed. I'm sure you can't. They've been part of your life for a long time. He laid down on his side on the blanket facing her. I'm sure some of them have grown and moved on. Are you still in contact with them? Most of them. Most settled in and around Orlan. Those that didn't write frequently, I've only lost touch with one or two. The ones who came to her as older teens didn't feel as connected to her. Are you satisfied? Is it enough for you? Yes and no. I'd love for all of them to come every single week to see me, but I understand that's not realistic. Some have moved west and started their own families. Cassie missed each and every one of them. Tino frowned. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would you live? Wherever the children are. You don't want to have children of your own? You'll never get them if you have no man in your life. Tino had never met a woman who didn't want children. She spent so much time around other people's children, he couldn't imagine that she didn't want some of her own. Cassie sighed. Of course I do. But I'm 36. Not many women start a family that late in life. I don't know why not. She laughed. If I had a child tomorrow, I'd be in my 50s by the time they were grown. Doesn't that seem too old? Sometimes she thought it did, but sometimes she didn't care. Tino shrugged. You're obsessed with age. You seem healthy, isn't that what really matters? Cassie laughed. It's awfully late for philosophical discussions. We need to be up early. I'd better get to bed. She got to her feet, brushing off her skirt. He nodded. I've really enjoyed talking to you. We'll have to do this again. Why don't I walk you to your front door? He said with a grin. She shook her head on a laugh. Oh, that would be lovely. She couldn't help but laugh as he got to his feet and offered her his arm, walking in the direction of the tent he put up for her. When they reached the tent, she turned to him. Thank you for seeing me to my door, sir. I had a lovely evening. The amusement in her voice was apparent. He stroked her cheek with one finger. You're joking, but this is the best night I've had in a long time. Thank you for spending it with me. Before Cassie had time to respond, he leaned down and pressed his lips against hers. She was startled. Never had she imagined a man like him would be interested in her. Good night. She lay in the dark for more than an hour, her lips still tingling from his kiss. This trip was certainly turning out to be different than she'd expected. Chapter 5. That first night set a pattern for the evenings to come. After the girls were in bed, Cassie would meet Tino at the fire. They would talk for an hour or so, and he would walk her to her tent. He didn't try to kiss her again, but every night she wondered if he would. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to or not. They had been on the road for a week when Cassie got a scare. She and Tino were sitting by the fire after the children had gone to bed as usual, when Opal came rushing out of the tent the 8 older girls were sharing. Mrs. Morgan. Ruby's missing. She went into the woods to relieve herself, and she never came back. I've looked everywhere. I can't find her. Opal sounded panicked. She couldn't have gone far, Cassie said. She looked at Tino. There hadn't been another adult around for her to rely on for a long time. Yes, there had been volunteers who helped at the orphanage, but none would help make any real decisions. Tino, we need to find her. Tino was already on his feet. I'll get some lanterns. You two wake the other girls. Cassie ran toward the tent of the younger girls. Girls, wake up. Teresa sat up, rubbing her eyes. Mrs. Morgan? What's wrong? Ruby's missing. Cassie told her. Get up quickly. We need to find her. The girls got to their feet as quickly as they could. How do we find her in the dark? Dorothy asked. Mr. Hayes, went to get some lanterns. We'll divide into groups. The girls all gathered around the campfire. Opal had woken the older girls. Cassie looked at Evelyn. We'll divide into 4 groups. Evelyn, you take Opal, Penelope, Betsy, and Hope. You girls search to the north. She turned to Gertrude. Gertie, you take Sarah Jane, Minnie, and Alice. Search to the west. I'll take Martha and Dorothy. Teresa, Hattie, and Katie, you girls go with Mr. Hayes. Tino had walked up behind her. We'll take the south. He handed each group leader a whistle. Blow that when you find her. We'll all meet back here as soon as we hear the whistle. Everyone rushed off in the direction they'd been given with their group. Cassie hurried to the east with Martha and Dorothy. Martha seemed particularly nervous. What if we can't find her? Cassie refused to even think about it. We'll find her. I'm sure she just wandered off and got lost. Deep down she wasn't so sure. She worried that Ruby had tried to head back to New York to be with David. How she thought she'd find her way to him, Cassie didn't know. They were already in Kentucky, in the mountains, and she worried for the girl. Hopefully they'd find her before an animal did. Tino felt out of place, with the 3 young girls placed in his care. As they walked, they all called Ruby's name over and over. The girls had only gone to bed 2 hours before, so he was certain she couldn't have gotten far. Cassie had told him that she had a beau back in New York, and he wondered if she tried to go back to him. He probably should have offered to take the north, but she would expect them to search in that direction. She seemed smart to him, so maybe she'd gone a different way. They'd been searching for about 10 minutes, when Katie put her hand on his arm and whispered, "Listen." He stopped, and he heard it too. There was a slight crinkling of leaves coming from their right. "Stay here, girls." He slowly walked in the direction of the sound, the lantern held high in front of him. He wasn't sure if it was an animal or Ruby, so he was wary. When he got close, he found the girl, her back to a tree with tears streaming down her face. "Ruby, are you all right?" Ruby nodded. "I just want to go home." Tino sighed, opening his arms wide. Ruby rushed into them, burying her face in his shoulder. "It's going to be all right. We'll be in Texas soon. You don't have a home in New York anymore." The words were harsh, but the compassion in his voice seemed to get through to her. Tino passed the whistle behind him to Katie, who blew it, while he held Ruby as she cried. After a moment, when she showed no signs of stopping, he pulled away. "We need to get back to camp. Everyone's worried about you." Ruby swiped at her tears with her sleeve. "I didn't mean to worry everyone. I don't want to go to Texas." "I understand. You have a beau back in New York, don't you?" Ruby nodded. "David. I miss him so much." "I know you do. He'll wait for you. You're worth it. And if he doesn't? Then he's not worth anything." Tino wrapped his arm around the girl's shoulder. "You can write him as soon as we get to Texas, and I'm sure he'll write back." Ruby sniffled. "I hope so. If he's smart, he will." Ruby giggled. "I wish we hadn't had to leave New York." "I know." Tino steered her back towards camp. "Changes like this are hard. Especially when you don't know they're coming. I think you girls should have been given more time to prepare." By the time they got back to camp, everyone else was waiting for them. Cassie rushed toward them, relief etched all over her face. She grabbed Ruby in a tight hug, holding her close. "Don't ever scare me like that again." Ruby looked down in embarrassment. "I didn't mean to scare anyone, I just wanted to go home." Cassie sighed. "And you thought you could walk all the way back to New York? You know we've come about 700 miles, right? I guess I wasn't really thinking. I miss David." Ruby looked down, obviously ashamed of running off. "I'm sure he misses you too." You can write to him as soon as we get to Texas. Ruby looked at Tino, who was herding the other girls back to their tents. That's what Mr. Hayes told me, too. Mr. Hayes is a smart man. Cassie looked at Ruby seriously. Will you promise me that you won't try anything like this again? I want your word on it, Ruby. Ruby sighed. I promise. I realized how stupid it was to even try while I was wandering around alone. I was so scared, Mrs. Morgan. I'm sorry. Her last words were a wail. Cassie smiled. I think that's punishment enough. This time. She left it unspoken that a punishment would occur if there were other problems. Go back to bed. Ruby rushed off to the tent she shared with her sister and the other older girls. As soon as she was gone, Cassie walked back to the campfire, knowing it would be a while before she could sleep. Tino came back from the woods and joined her at the fire, sitting much closer than she was used to. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. Are you all right? Before she knew it, Cassie was crying into his shoulder. I was so scared. What would she have done if Ruby had been injured? Or lost to them altogether? Or worse? I know. He stroked her hair, doing his best to calm her. He'd never had a sobbing female in his arms before, and now twice in one night he'd had to calm one. This trip was changing him in more ways than he'd imagined. After a minute, Cassie pulled away from him, using the handkerchief he handed her to wipe her tears. Thank you. I didn't even know I needed to cry until you asked me that. He smiled, stroking her cheek with one finger. Have you cried at all since you were kicked out of your home and sent to another state? She shook her head. I don't cry much. Maybe it was time. Thank you for finding my girl. She was surprised at how well he'd handled the situation. She knew that she and the girls were just a job to him, but he'd acted as if finding Ruby really mattered to him. I couldn't leave her out there alone, he said, surprised that she felt the need to thank him. She's my responsibility too. Your job is just to drive us, not to care for the girls. That's my job. Well, it's a job we'll share until I leave you in nowhere. He frowned, hating the idea of leaving her and the girls. He knew he couldn't ask her to wait for him, though. Texas was still populated with more men than women, and she would be married in no time if she wanted to be. What's wrong? Why are you frowning? Cassie had never seen him upset or angry. I hate the idea of leaving you, he said simply. Really? Why would he not want to leave her? Really? He reached out and caught the back of her neck, pulling her close for his kiss. The one kiss they'd shared before had been a simple brush of his lips across hers, but this one showed his need. He pressed her close to him, his mouth taking possession of hers. His tongue stroked along the seam of her lips, asking for entrance. Cassie wrapped her arms around Tino and held him close, kissing him back with every bit of passion she felt for him. Her hand stroked his muscled shoulders as she pressed close. His hand moved around to cup her breast through her dress, and she let out a low moan, finally pulling away. We can't. Any one of the girls could come out and see us. He knew she was right. On 3 different nights, one of the girls had wandered out of the tent and talked to them for a moment on their way to the woods to answer nature's call. He took deep gulping breaths, his passion stronger for her than he had ever felt. I need you, Cassie. Cassie stared into his eyes with surprise. I need to go to bed. She jumped to her feet. I'll see you in the morning. Hurrying to her tent, she got into her bed and curled into a ball on her side. She'd never imagined she would feel the kind of passion she'd felt for Stanley for another man. Was she betraying him? Stanley had long since faded from her memory. He'd been gone so long, she barely remembered what he looked like. Tino was her future. She knew it. If only he could find it in him to settle down somewhere and take permanent responsibility for her girls. Chapter 6. The rest of the trip was uneventful. By the time they reached nowhere, the girls were actually excited to see their new home. They were all travel-weary, and ready to spend some time out of the bus. They looked forward to sleeping in real beds, and not on the ground as well. Cassie found herself more and more regretful that her time with Tino was coming to an end. She'd fallen a little more in love with him every day, and couldn't imagine what it would be like once he was gone. Losing her husband had been a true blow, and she didn't think she'd ever be able to fill the hole he left in her life. But now that she'd met Tino, she knew the hole could be filled in, and she wasn't sure how she'd feel when he was gone. Tino drove straight to the church, knowing the pastor there would be able to direct them to their new home. They arrived early afternoon on a Sunday, just as church was letting out. Tino walked up to the pastor and introduced himself. "I have a bus full of girls here. I've been told that you're willing to host a new girls' home here in nowhere. Can you direct me to the house that was purchased for them?" The pastor gave him a blank look. "House? Girls? I have no idea what you're talking about." Tino couldn't help but feel panicked. Had that snake dare lied to them? "Please tell me you're pulling my leg." The pastor shook his head. He was a young man who looked truly sorry not to have the answer Tino needed. "I really have no idea what you're talking about. Do you know who you talked to? I didn't make the arrangements. I was hired to drive 15 girls and their caretaker from New York to Nowhere, Texas. I am in Nowhere, right?" Tino had no idea what he would do if there was really no house for these girls. He simply couldn't stay and arrange something for them. What if the lead on his brother was a good one this time, and he missed him? He had to tie things up before he could move on. "This is Nowhere, all right. I still don't know what you're talking about. Did someone come here to find the house?" The pastor looked confused about the whole situation, but seemed sympathetic. Tino shrugged. "Let me ask Mrs. Morgan what she knows. She may have more information on the house than I do." As he walked toward the bus, Tino prayed that Cassie knew something he didn't. The pastor stood waiting for a moment, watching as Tino went back to the bus. An older couple stopped to talk to him. The woman was dressed in a lavender dress and a hideous hat, with peppermint sticks sticking out of her bodice. The three of them watched as Tino brought Mrs. Morgan back to them. Cassie was wringing her hands as she talked to the pastor. "You really didn't know we were coming?" "I was told to come to the pastor here in town. The house was supposed to have been purchased for the girls and I." The pastor shook his head. "I'm so sorry, but I have no idea what was said to you. No one talked to me about any girls or any house." Cassie looked at Tino. "What are we going to do? We've been traveling for 2 weeks. We have no home." Yes, he was leaving, but she had to rely on him, because there was no one else. Tino shook his head. "I'm sure it was Mr. Dare." "Who else?" "He probably kept the money for himself. A man who would remove 15 orphans from their home would do anything." The old woman that had been talking to the pastor looked at Cassie. "Where did you get 15 girls?" she asked. Cassie sighed. "I've known most of the girls since they were small. I've been running the orphanage in New York for 15 years. 2 weeks ago, a church took over the orphanage and decided to turn it into a boys' home. I had to leave with the older girls. I was promised that they purchased a house that would be waiting for us here in Nowhere, Texas. We've been traveling for 2 weeks, and now there's no house for us to live in. I don't know what we're going to do." Cassie was exhausted emotionally and physically. She wasn't sure she could handle anything else going wrong. The old woman shook her head sadly. "Are any of those children bastards by any chance?" Cassie was surprised by the hopeful look on the woman's face as well as the excitement in her voice. "Do you want them to be bastards?" The woman shrugged. "Why, I've always had a soft spot for bastards." 15 girls, you say?" Cassie nodded. "You don't happen to know anyone who's willing to take on 15 girls and their caretaker, do you?" She felt the tears pricking her eyes as she asked the question. Of course, she didn't. No one wanted to take on 15 girls and their caretaker. At least it was spring, and they had the tents to live in. The woman smiled and clapped her hands. "I just so happen to have a house big enough for 15 girls, and I've been praying for God to drop a bastard on my doorstep." Cassie gaped at the woman. How many people prayed for bastards to show up on their doorstep? What was wrong with this woman? "You have?" The woman nodded. I'm Edna Petunia, by the way. Edna Petunia Sanders. She pulled a man out from behind her. This here's my husband Cletus. We're newlyweds. Cletus looked like he'd rather be anywhere in the world than at a church wearing his suit. His beard was long, and seemed to be stained with tobacco juice. It's nice to meet you both. Cassie looked back and forth between them. Newlyweds? They had to be in their 70s. I always wanted a house full of kids, but I just met Cletus here a few months ago. I didn't have any bastard children of my own, so I was hoping now that I was ready to raise some, God would provide them for me. And he has. Edna eyed Cassie. You are going to let me have those bastard girls, aren't you? If anyone else had called her girls bastards, Cassie would have been offended. For some reason it didn't bother her coming from Edna Petunia. The old woman seemed to genuinely care about the girls' welfare even though she'd never met them. I can't let you just have my girls. Most of them have been mine for as long as they can remember. Edna shrugged. Why don't you just move in with them? Problem solved. Cassie's eyes grew wider. Are you trying to tell me you want 16 strangers to move in with you with no notice? As long as 15 of those are my bastard girls, I don't know why not. Cassie looked at Cletus. And you wouldn't mind if 16 people moved in with you? Cletus's voice was gruff. If it makes my little turtle dove happy, I sure don't have no complaints. He gazed at Edna Petunia with such a loving expression that Cassie was amazed. She wanted that kind of love for herself. She looked at Tino, wondering if he noticed the other couple as well. Tino glanced down at Cassie. What do you say? Are you and the girls willing to stay with them? He couldn't leave until they were settled, and he had a man to talk to in Fort Worth about Sebastian. He didn't want to hurry away, but he'd been searching too long to pass up this opportunity. Cassie slowly nodded. She'd hoped that he'd agree to stay, and they could raise the girls together. She knew his leaving was for the best. Tino would never be able to settle down. I suppose it's our only option. She looked at Edna Petunia. We'll accept your hospitality. Thank you so much for giving us a place to live. Edna bounced on the balls of her feet and clapped her hands. You'll come over right away? Between the two of us, we can get those girls settled in no time. Cassie smiled. Of course. Let me just go tell the girls. Do you want to come meet them? Edna shook her head. No need. I know I'll love them like they're my very own bastards. She turned Cletus. You give this nice man directions to our house, then we need to hurry home so I can make lunch for my new family. The woman was positively ecstatic about the prospect of having 15 orphans move in with her. Cletus shrugged. Makes more sense for you to just follow us. He looked over at the bus. Ain't never seen one of those around here. We're just in a buggy. You have to follow slow. Tino nodded. Buses don't go all that fast anyway. We'll be right behind you. He followed Cassie back to the bus, wondering why he just felt like he'd given away his entire life. Chapter 7. On the way to the Sanders house, Cassie talked to the girls about the old woman. The woman's name is Edna Petunia Sanders. She wants you all to be her children. She didn't mention that the woman kept calling them bastard girls, because she didn't want to offend them. That old woman looked crazy, Hope said. Are you sure it's safe? Cassie sighed. I'm not sure of anything. I just know we don't have a choice at this point. She said she's got a house big enough for all of us, beggars can't be choosers. She wanted to sound more positive, but she couldn't force herself to lie to the girls. We can't keep living on the side of the road in tents forever. Hattie looked at Tino slyly. Maybe Mr. Hayes could stay with us for long enough to build a house. Cassie knew the girl fancied her and Tino as a couple. Mr. Hayes has other things he needs to be doing. She did her best to keep her voice steady as she said the words, desperately wanting to break down and cry. Tino drove slowly behind the old man, listening to the conversation behind him. He wished he could tell the girls he could stay around to build a house, but he really did need to go look for his brother. He'd made himself a promise that he wouldn't stop until his brother was found, and he was so close. He didn't want to leave Cassie or the girls, but he had to. Cassie wished that Tino would say something, anything that would make her feel better, but he just drove silently. One of the girls gasped as they saw the huge house they stopped in front of. "Are we going to live there?" asked Opal, her voice a reverent whisper. Cassie gaped at the house. "It looks like we are." She couldn't connect in her mind the beautiful house in front of them and the crazy old couple she'd met at the church. She got off the bus, careful not to make eye contact with Tino. She didn't want him to know how much she hated the fact that he had to leave her. Edna Petunia rushed up the steps and threw open the front door. "This is your new home, girls." Cassie turned and saw that all of the girls had followed her off the bus silently. Every single girl stood staring at the house in awe. Even though Edna had said that the house was big enough for her and all of the girls, Cassie hadn't quite believed it until she saw it. Why, the girls might even have 2 or 3 rooms between them. "I didn't know you were coming, so all the beds aren't made up. The linens are all clean though." Edna Petunia looked at all the girls. "Would you mind making up your own beds? My room is downstairs, and I prefer not to climb those stairs. My mind may be young, but my knees are old." Evelyn stepped forward. "We're orphans, ma'am. No one has made up a bed for us since we were tiny. We're just happy to have beds to sleep in." Edna smiled, folding her hands over her voluminous belly. "Orphans? Tell me, are any of you girls big enough to help cook?" "Why, all of them are." Cassie couldn't allow Edna Petunia to call her girls bastards. As soon as she could, she would have to have a talk with the older woman. "Oh, speaking of cooking, I need to hurry and get some lunch on the table. Do any of you girls want to help me?" Edna didn't wait for an answer as she rushed into the house and into the kitchen. Cassie gathered the girls together into a tight group. "Mrs. Sanders doesn't seem to have the ability to know what is right and wrong to say. Please don't get your feelings hurt over anything she says to you." Opal grinned. "I have a feeling we really will be having an adventure living with her." All of the girls looked terribly excited now that they'd met Edna Petunia. Cassie just hoped she hadn't bitten off more than she could chew by agreeing to move in with the old woman. An hour later, all the beds had been made. The girls had unpacked their things as Tino had carried them up the stairs. There were 9 bedrooms between her and the girls. Cassie and Gertrude both had their own rooms. Gertie had never had her own room, and was incredibly excited. The other girls had voted to let her have her own room. Cassie didn't mention that it was because she was too bossy for any of them to want to share with her. They went down the stairs for lunch, and as soon as they hit the first floor, the wonderful smells wafted through the air. "Mrs. Sanders must be a good cook," Hope exclaimed. Cassie smiled. She was glad they wouldn't have to pretend to like what they were served. Of course, the girls knew how to do it when they needed to. They would never hurt the feelings of their hostess. They followed their noses into the dining room and found Mr. Sanders and Tino already seated at the table. Tino had a grim look on his face. Cassie didn't let her eyes meet Tino's. She knew he was leaving at any moment, and she didn't know how she was going to say goodbye without crying. She wanted nothing more than to beg him to stay, but she knew she couldn't keep him from his search for his brother. The girls chattered animatedly throughout the meal. Cassie forced herself to swallow the excellent food. It all tasted like sawdust to her. "We'll get you girls enrolled in school tomorrow." "Are all of you still in school?" Edna Petunia asked. Evelyn nodded, speaking for all of them. "Yes, but Ruby, Opal, and I are about ready to graduate. If the teacher here agrees with our teacher back home, we'll be able to graduate this spring." Edna frowned. "That's not enough time for me to have you girls. You'll just have to stay on after you graduate. You can find jobs and stay here." Her tone of voice told them they had no choice. She wanted them all to stay forever. Cassie heard her words and shook her head. She'd never met anyone who was so anxious to have orphans stay with them for a long period of time. Hopefully the woman would even learn to stop calling them bastards constantly. When Edna stood up to do the dishes after the meal, the girls all told her to stay. Oh, we'll do all the dishes. We'll even do the cooking if you'd like. Dorothy jumped up and worked on clearing the table while she spoke. We're just so thankful for a place like this to stay. I've never seen such a beautiful house. I'm just as thankful that you girls agreed to live here, Edna told her. Tino pushed back from the table then. I need to be on my way. I have to stop in Fort Worth on my way back. He wasn't in a hurry to go, but he couldn't stay. It was torture to be with Cassie, knowing he needed to leave at any moment. Cassie stood to follow him outside. She knew she shouldn't put herself through the goodbye, but she couldn't let him go without at least wishing him safe travels. She badly wanted to pour her heart out to him, but she knew it would only make him uncomfortable. She followed him to the bus. Be safe, I'll miss you. The words she really wanted to say were left unspoken, but she knew his heart heard them. A look of anguish crossed Tino's face. He pulled her into his arms and held her close. He didn't feel like he could kiss her, because any of the girls could come out at any point. He wanted to tell her he'd be back, but he wasn't sure how soon he could make it. He had to find his brother. He kissed the top of her head and turned away to get onto the bus. He drove away without looking back even once. He knew if he saw her face again, he wouldn't be able to go.